Britain's fight against slavery was the most expensive international moral effort in modern world history. But they were not alone in this fight, and their strongest allies came from Africa itself. Roughly 11.5 million people were taken from Africa to be used as slaves in the Americas between 1450 and 1900, and everybody with ships that could make the journey was involved. Abolitionists in Britain used a window of opportunity created by overproduction in the British Caribbean colonies in 1807 to push an act through Parliament that stopped Britain from trading in slaves. But as the trade was still extremely profitable, it was far from over. At first, Britain tried to get all the other European powers to follow their lead. They wanted everybody at the Congress of Vienna to take action, but all they got were some words. So they moved on to pressuring each power individually. The Netherlands signed treaties with Britain in 1814 and 1818 to abolish its own slave trade, only to then use the court system to stop them being enforced. While that was going on, Britain gave Spain a massive bribe of £400,000 in exchange for a treaty to abolish the slave trade, but as it would have ruined Spain's Cuban colony, this treaty ended up not worth the paper it was written on. The French signed a treaty in 1818 and even agreed to send their own squadron down to West Africa to enforce it. But by 1820, the British West African Squadron had realised that the French enforcement was so lax, they might well have not been there at all. By this time, the United States had made several attempts to ban the slave trade, but they were not enforced, as the US refused to allow the West Africa Squadron to enforce them using what was called the right of mutual search. By 1839, they were the only big player that still refused to sign a treaty that included the right of mutual search. Despite all of these treaties, the trade continued. Between 1811 and 1867, over 2 million people were dragged across the Atlantic, destined for the plantations of the New World. This is about 20% of the entire Atlantic slave trade. The massive scale of smuggling was because the demand for slave labour in the New World rose during the 19th century. There was a fortune to be made supplying the plantations of Cuba and Brazil. They would be taken from places like southeastern Africa, which exported 386,000 people, or Angola, which exported 827,000. Over 50% of the people leaving Africa had Brazil as their destination. The Bight of Biafra was also a major exporter. The ruling class accepted the trade, as selling people was far more profitable than selling palm oil. It also gave the local leaders a tool to punish real or imagined enemies by sending them into an exile from which they would never return. In the same way that European rulers used sentences of transportation as an alternative to execution. The West Africa Squadron hauled in slave ships of every nationality, and then let the court systems sort out any problems. Aggressive interceptions were the norm. One returned to Sierra Leone with 3 Spanish ships and a cargo valued over £10,000, and the naval regulations stated that every man on board would receive a share of the bounty for every person freed. Between 1807 and the middle of 1815, the Treasury paid out £191,000 in bounties, and they were found some of these people were held in the most terrible conditions. In 1822, HMS Thistle captured a small Portuguese schooner with 30 Africans chained up in a space barely 17 inches high. Faced with this Sisyphean task, Britain could have reversed course. France did. France had accidentally abolished slavery in 1793, only to restore it again in 1802. Or Britain could have chosen the path that most other nations did, of signing an abolition treaty and then ignoring it. Instead, they doubled down. There were 10 ships in the West Africa Squadron before 1835. This increased to 15 between 1835 and 1843. It then doubled to 30 between 1844 and the early 1850s. Between them, they would free about 200,000 people. The treaties that Britain signed meant that it had the right to search ships from most of the maritime powers, but they also meant the slaves had to be caught in the act. Slavers slipped into African rivers and stayed there quietly at anchor, often knowing that there was a cruiser waiting for them at sea. But if the warship was ever called away, All the captives would be loaded. By the time that the cruiser got back, the ship would have disappeared with her holds full of enslaved people. Trying to follow into shallow water was dangerous. In 1847, HMS Hydra was trying to facilitate a legitimate trade deal on the River Bonny. She grounded on a hidden sandbank. She had to throw several of her guns overboard before she was light enough to float free. Had this happened in front of an armed and desperate slave trader, it could have been disastrous. In 1849, one captain had a shallow draft cutter made from iron so that he could send his crews inshore. But this was not the only type of vessel they had for riding out the coastline's high surf. They also had the boats made by Britain's most reliable allies in their fight against the slave trade. These were the expert boatmen of the crew-speaking peoples of West Africa. The crew signed on as deckhands with all kinds of ships and often brought their canoes along so they could paddle home once they had received their payment. They took work from anybody, but they preferred to work with the Royal Navy. The pay was the highest, and they had the greatest chance of returning to their villages with tales of glory. They could perform the duties of any sailor aboard, but they specialised in crewing the small boats. In 1820, a small boat from HMS Thistle was dispatched up the River Pongo, under the command of a young midshipman. A merchant by the name of Proctor had been trying to establish a legitimate trade within the area, only to have his ship stolen by a slave trader called Curtis. The midshipman had been sent to demand the return of Mr. Proctor's property. Curtis responded by firing on them. 4 of the crew managed to escape, but the rest were taken captive. Curtis murdered the young officer and 6 of his sailors. Their bodies were mutilated and left to be eaten by animals. He didn't kill the 2 West Africans with them, but that was only because he thought he could make money by selling them as slaves. They were saved from this fate by the governor of Sierra Leone. He sent a force of 4 ships and 150 men to rescue them and avenge their comrades. Curtis slunk away into the woods rather than be captured. So the British had to make do with burning down his trading post and putting him out of business. A year later, HMS Thistle was investigating the Bonny River. A canoe paddled up to them, thinking that they were a Spanish slaver. They soon realised their mistake, but before they could get away, the captain and a West African sailor jumped on board. They forced the men in the canoe to surrender. But then they had an idea. When the Spaniard arrived, 35 men from the Thistle were hiding in the canoe. They were paddled over to the slaver and sprang aboard. Some of the slaver's crew managed to get hold of their muskets, wounding 3 British sailors, but despite being outnumbered, the British captured the ship and freed 450 Africans that were being held on board. Through actions like this, the men of the crew-speaking peoples forged a new identity as crewmen, with a fierce opposition to the slave trade at its core. They formed the lion's share of landing parties sent to hunt slave traders ashore because of both their bravery and the fact that they were immune to the local diseases that killed so many Europeans. By the time that the Thistle was paid off in 1823, Captain Hagen and his crew had managed to save 4,000 people from slavery, but the fight against the trade was far from over. 20 years later, in 1846, HMS Flying Fish was chasing a felucca that they believed to be involved in the slave trade. It tried to escape by heading into shallow water. Their captain knew that the warship could not follow, but he didn't know the area as well as he thought he did. She grounded, and the wreck was soon surrounded by thousands of looters hoping to salvage what they could. The British wanted something from the wreck as well, but what they wanted was the intelligence that it could provide. They sent 2 whalers under a lieutenant and a midshipman, plus a jolly boat with 5 West African crewmen. The West Africans managed to get their boat through the surf to the shore, but both whalers were swamped. Midshipman Simpson was more dead than alive by the time that he managed to get to shore, only to be knocked down by one of the people that had come to take what he could from the wreck. The man started to strip him, but he was saved by a crewman. Another crewman managed to save the body of the drowned lieutenant. He even managed to get it back to the ship when the sailors ashore had to wait until they could build a raft from the timbers of the wrecked ship. Jumping forward another 20 years, there were still West African crewmen serving with the Royal Navy. The Atlantic slave trade had come to an end, and the Admiralty had told their captains not to recruit any more crewmen due to the difficulty in getting them home at the end of their service. However, they were still wanted to serve, and in 1869 a number were serving on board HMS Dryad, chasing a slave ship off the east coast of Africa. The slaver ran aground, and its crew abandoned the enslaved people on board to drown. Small boats were launched to try and save them. One, a gig, had a crewman from Sierra Leone, known as Jim George, on board. The gig capsized by a large wave, but Jim George still managed to save 2 enslaved children, as well as one of his comrades who could not swim. He was awarded a medal by the Royal Humane Society for his actions, but his adventure did not put him off the Navy. A year later, he volunteered for continuous service. However, it wasn't just the Navy which was able to make use of small boats. The slavers too changed their tactics. During 1837, 30,000 slaves were smuggled into Brazil, with not one of them landed at Rio de Janeiro. The ships left with trade groups, but arrived back with only ballast. They'd landed their human cargo elsewhere along the coast. A whole system of shore signals was created in order to tell them when it was safe to smuggle their cargoes ashore. It was going to take more aggressive action to suppress the trade, and I shall start talking about that next time. So please like and subscribe so that the algorithm might let you know when I post it.